Welcome back to part 6 in my installment of the short story, The Eighth Dwarf. This is our second to last installment. As you'll recall from our previous episode, Sleazy had returned to the United States, had gotten back on his feet, and led a labor walkout and protest in front of Walt Disney's house, hoping to leverage that into getting Walt's help to find out whatever the heck happened to Snow White. So now let's continue with part 6 of The Eighth Dwarf. Sleazy never gave up looking for Snow White. He made several trips to Europe once the war was over, but post-war records were in such a shambles it was impossible to find her. At a time when hundreds of thousands of refugees were being dispersed across the continent, many disappearing into the Soviet Union never to be heard from again, Sleazy waded into the diaspora searching for his true love. He looked in Germany, Holland, Belgium, and Poland. He combed the SS archives, traveled to refugee camps, interviewed military personnel, and met with resettlement organizations. He even traveled to Palestine before it was Israel, but there was no trace of Snow White. It was as if she, along with tens of millions of others, had vanished. When Sleazy couldn't find her, he returned to Los Angeles. I'd say heartbroken, but into how many pieces can an already broken heart be broken? He continued with union organizing, which put food on the table. When cartoons experienced a resurgence along with television in the 1950s, a lot of us hoped Sleazy would make the transition. But he couldn't even get a call back for Chilly Willy. The 1950s may have been a boom time for animation, but it was hard to swallow the stuff Hanna-Barbera was foisting on the public. There was no quality to it. Their big hit, The Flintstones, used repeating background so often a hamster on its wheels saw more scenery than the citizens of Bedrock. And that was the golden era. Walt used to say he didn't even consider them competition. Of course, it was Walt's fault that Hanna-Barbera got started in the first place. After the strike, he laid off so many animators that Hanna-Barbera was only too glad to pick them up, with a raise to boot. Still, animators hated working for those two. It took Yogi Bear to make Walt Disney look good. But there was a reason Sleazy couldn't find work in television. It had to do with Walt's testimony in a closed-door session before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. That's when Walt showed a photograph he had taken of the strikers outside his house. When he named Sleazy the chief agitator, the dwarf found himself on Hollywood's blacklist. One thing you could say about Walt, he knew how to get even. The 1950s may have been rough for Sleazy, but they were good for Walt. That's when his all long-held ideas came to fruition. The theme park had always been uppermost in his mind, but he needed a way to fund it that didn't involve the banks. His Sunday night television program, The Wonderful World of Disney, was the answer. ABC had no idea Walt would turn their Sunday nights into one big advertisement for Disneyland. It was his best idea yet. In addition to the Sunday night show, we also began producing the Mickey Mouse Club for daily syndication, as well as a string of low-cost, live-action kiddie programs. Most of them were dogs, but a few, like Davy Crockett, made us a bundle. By this time, Walt was ubiquitous. He not only hosted his own Sunday night television show, he was America's kindly uncle, a goodwill ambassador to the world. Yeah, kindly with a nickel. But when it came to the old days, you had a better chance of encountering No Line at Space Mountain than Walt Disney's remembering his friends. Walt was on everybody's A-list then. By God, the U.S. government even put him on a stamp, though it only cost 6 cents. But in spite of his success, Walt was unhappy. He may have come a long way from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but I used to hear him complain how little he'd achieved. I saw a lot of Walt back then, and I don't mind saying I thought he was a bit unhinged on the subject. Oh, sure, he had his Oscars, but they weren't close to being consolation. He wanted more. Sleazy was nothing but an anecdote by then. It was possible Walt didn't even remember him. I'd heard through the grapevine that union organizing had dried up and the Eighth Dwarf had been reduced to wrestling gigs and an early version of dwarf bowling. Someone else told me he'd become a bookie, which made better sense. Sleazy always did like the ponies, and I'd seen him at Santa Anita more than once. You can imagine my surprise then when, out of the blue, I got a phone call from him asking to meet. I figured he was going to put the arm on me, but for old time's sake I said, "What the heck?" and agreed to breakfast. It was a sunny morning, January 1963, when Sleazy and I met at the Polo Lounge. I remember it was unseasonably cold that morning and the sky so blue you wondered where the smog had gone. Sleazy looked sharp for a guy who made his living as a bookie. He certainly wasn't hurting for money. I'll never forget the beautiful camel hair coat, the color of butterscotch he wore that day. It must have cost a mint. I was glad to see him looking so well. After we'd placed our order, Sleazy was quick to tell me about his search for Snow White. I was surprised he was still looking for her. I assumed she was dead. Though he had nothing good to say about Walt, the fire had gone out of his hatred. He seemed more focused on his career than revenge. After some chit-chat, he got right to the point. Sliding a copy of Daily Variety across the table, Sleazy nodded at the headline. It read, "Disney Studios announces new musical." The subhead was more of the same. Singing Nanny promises Boffo box office, says King of Kids. "Yeah, so we got another feature in production," I responded. "What else is new?" "Not just any feature," Sleazy said with a grin. "This one's Mary Poppins, and it has the perfect part for me." "How do you figure?" I said, dipping my spoon into a cup of chilled prunes. Sleazy tapped the paper. "I was born to play the role of Jane Banks." "Jane Banks? Who's that?" The 8-year-old daughter." I was so dumbfounded I didn't know what to say. It was the worst casting idea since John Wayne played Genghis Khan, but there was no talking him out of it. "Look, I know I can do this," Sleazy insisted. "I've got the British accent down, and I've been taking dance lessons. I've even read the book. Besides, Walt owes me." Finally, my exasperation leaked through. "Sleazy, the part calls for an 8-year-old girl. How do you plan to get around that minor detail?" Sleazy snapped his fingers like he hadn't a care in the world. "Not a problem. I've already talked to wardrobe. A gingham dress and some pigtails, and it's Rule Britannia, baby. Besides, it's not that big a part, and they can always dub my singing voice later. What say you, Kimosabe?" At first, I didn't know what to think, especially since Sleazy was so eager. But was Mary Poppins the right comeback for a 47-year-old dwarf? The part of Igor in a Hammer horror film seemed more like it. Still, crazier things have happened in this town. Did I really have the right to step on a man's dream after what Sleazy had been through? "I'm not sure the public's ready for you in this role," I said gently. But Sleazy was no dummy. He knew he had an ace in the hole, so he played one. "Tell Walt if he'll meet with me, all is forgiven." Since I knew Sleazy's story better than anyone, it was hard to refuse him. "All right, I'll plead your case, but no promises." Sleazy's smile was as broad as it was sincere. "Thank you. I knew I could count on you. Check, please." Sleazy dropped a 50 on the table, thanked me for coming, and donned a pair of sunglasses with just the right amount of attitude for a town where attitude counts nearly as much as talent. I wished him the best. All right, that's the end of part 6. Our next installment will be the last in The Eighth Dwarf. Thanks for listening.